We're going to continue on. Hamish was already mentioned a few times by Colin. Hamish Hansford, he is the Deputy Secretary, Cyber and Infrastructure Security at the Department of Home Affairs. So he's going to talk to us about advancing protective security settings for the protection of all. He's the Deputy Secretary of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Group in the Department of Home Affairs, joined the department in 2016, and leads cybersecurity, protective security, data security, and information security policies, and also manages the Australian Regulatory Authority for 11 critical infrastructure sectors like transport security, telco security. So we're in very safe hands, I understand. Hamish, are you ready to come up and share all your knowledge with us for the next half hour? He also, you can give it up. And perhaps share also a little bit about your leadership experience in border protection and so on as part of your presentation. So welcome. Thank you.
Well, thanks so very much. And Colin, I think you've started or ended rather where I wanted to start, which is that I find that this is the most challenging environment for security professionals in Australia, at least since the Second World War. And that means that by virtue of you coming here today to try and learn and engage, I think that's the future of how we need to act together and professionalize the security industry by constantly engaging in what is, and you've heard it from Colin this morning, what is both simple and complex. I wanted to share some thoughts about what we've seen over the last year in the security environment, which might get you to think about where we might collectively focus our efforts. And the first observation that we've had is risk is not very well understood, particularly by the C-suite. And risk is effectively embedded into our society in a whole range of different ways. If you look back even to one of those great German sociologists, Ulrich Beck, he talked about risk being embedded in society that was managed, first of all, by individual families and then by institutions like the government that ran critical infrastructure and schools and community groups. But then came to the conclusion in the 90s that risk is embedded into systems and networks, and that while regulation can try and resolve that risk, actually every security professional, perhaps didn't use the word security professional back then, needs to think about risk and prioritize it in different ways because it's fundamentally embedded in society. And while you can mitigate it, you've got to be able to deal with what is an untrusted environment. And that, I think, has permeated our society as systems and networks have developed over the last 40 years and become increasingly more challenging and difficult. So that's our first observation, that risk is becoming much more challenging. And conversely, we need to start to think more in risk terms and have that as a foundation of our work. And I know it underpins a lot of our standards and working, but I think is becoming more and more important. It's becoming more and more important because our second observation is that our threat environment is becoming much more convergent. You only need to look this week about what has changed, particularly with the calling out of the IRCG by the Australian government and their involvement in anti-Semitic attacks. We've identified 2, and our minister has said that there are more on the way, even today calling out the fact that the People's Republic of China has impacted over 80 countries in the world, including Australia, and there's a joint advisory out this morning which goes to that fact. Internationally, we've seen in the last 12 months a state-based impact on the air cargo system and regime, sabotage melding into espionage and other state-based threats to Europe, and we've seen things like cutting of cables in the Baltic states. Lots of convergent threats that are challenging the way that we have both organised ourselves within industry and government and are blending the thematics. And so we're thinking very much around how do you build capability to try and respond to a whole multitude of different threats, which makes risk more important. And an example of that we're talking to the police about is if you're thinking about the thematic crime types of child exploitation, online radicalisation, or cybercrime, what's the enabling capabilities that will help us deal with all of those different crime types? How do we think about that in a different way? Because you see different commands coming through and thinking about the thematic threats and becoming deep experts in a whole range of thematic crime types. But actually, when you think about it, if the digitization of the response is the key element that binds all of those crime types together, how do we think about things in a different way? And so we're thinking very much around how do we tackle threats in a different way, given the convergent threat environment? And it doesn't mean that we are going to focus less on terrorism, counter foreign interference, sabotage, cybercrime. We're thinking about it in a different way. And the events of this week, I think, challenge us all in the security industry to think about what does that fundamentally mean for our work? How do we start to think about things in a different way? And so I think that's a demanding of us to think about things differently. When we think about organizations and think about the structures of organizations, no matter how big or small they are, we often see cyber treated separately to risk, particularly physical and personnel security risk. And I think the very first observation that I've seen, particularly with critical infrastructure, but also governments, both state and territory, local government and the Commonwealth government, is how do you bring those risks together at an enterprise level? How do you think about the totality of risk, and how do we put that in front of particularly CEOs and boards to make sure that they are thinking about enterprise risk? And one of the kind of key challenges that we've observed, and I've definitely observed when I've visited boardrooms and CEOs across the country, is that there is a disconnect between security risk officers and the C-suite. And the disconnect is often in the level of technical aptitude of particularly boards and CEOs trying to get to the heart of what investment decision or what risk mitigation are you seeking, and how will it mitigate the risk, and what is the residual risk? And often there's a disconnect between particularly the technical and cyber language. And you got a bit of a sense from Colin about how difficult that is, but I thought you broke it down very well. How do you break that down into real decisions for boards and particularly CEOs? Because the number one piece of feedback they give me is I get presented with a bill, and what I don't know is if I don't invest in that capability, in that mitigation, what does that mean for my enterprise? And so I think there's an opportunity for us to skill ourselves in using our technology capability to be able to put things in different terms that leaders can understand. And if that is putting an economic lens over it, I think that is a particularly useful thing, because the key disconnect that I often see at a sub-level is then the chief financial officer will come in with a view and isn't well informed. And so I think it's incumbent on all of us to think about how influential am I, how influential can I be, and what might get me the better outcome. And I think that is a fundamental change that, given the environment that we're in, given those convergent threats, given the pace of threat environment that we face, how do we change the dynamic within organizations? So maybe there's an opportunity for us to lead there. The thing that I hate doing in my job is talking to people when there's been a major crisis and they're emotionally coming to the situation for the first time. And so the worst time to develop an incident response plan or a crisis plan is in the middle of a crisis. The best calls we have are people who have worked with us on exercises, on building the relationship, so that in the middle of a crisis, we'll say, yeah, we practiced this a couple of months ago, or remember we talked about this scenario and you told me that you'd had a board discussion or a scenario that you'd planned for this. So we've got it under control. What are we going to do next, and how are we going to face it? Some of the feedback that we've had from particularly cyber crisis managers, CEOs, and chief risk officers over the last 12 months is they weren't emotionally prepared for the toll it would take to deal with a crisis. They were technically prepared, might have done a desktop scenario or a much deeper scenario, but emotionally they didn't realize how actually difficult it is to run a 24/7 operation. And that after a couple of days, you run out of emotion and you become much more frayed, and you become much more challenged to be able to deal with the crisis. One of the best examples in the last couple of years that we've seen is where a CEO at the start of every meeting said, how are we all dealing with our own mental health and the stress? And that was from in the healthcare sector. And it was flipping the crisis scenario around to put people at the heart of that response. So that was one of the big learnings. The other one was that people did not quite anticipate how much regulators would be interested in trying to work out not only the stability of the system, but to give confidence that there wasn't a contagion effect, particularly if it was a cyber incident. And so foundationally, I don't think people expect that there are different stakeholders that you might not expect to be interested during a crisis scenario comparative to your day-to-day operations. And that foundationally and fundamentally, I think shapes the response for some industry. One CEO in particular told me that they had to report to 27 different regulators or government authorities. Now, I think they chose to do that, but they chose to do it because of the pressure that they were under in that particular crisis. Others have reflected to me that in the middle of a crisis, it took them much longer than they would have liked to turn the tables on the media driving the response versus them driving the media response. And so getting on the front foot, communicating clearly was of paramount concern. And one entity told me that the most demanding customers for them weren't the actual customers, it was the staff. Because the lack of communication with staff during an incident was so much less than what they were providing to their customers, because they were viewed very much on the customer is the key client. But if you can't get your staff across the issue and engage with customers in a different way, then there's no point in prioritizing customers first. The pace of change during an incident and the cost that companies are facing is weighing on them so heavily. And I think, how do we get ahead of that? How do we show leadership? And how do we make sure that responding to events is business as usual? And remembering in the back of our collective minds that Australia has never had a catastrophic incident, particularly a cyber incident. We've come close, and we are still dealing with the majority of incidents being data breaches. And that, I think, has shaped our environment. But as security professionals, one of the challenges that I think we should have in mind is, how do we think about the worst case scenario? How do we put ourselves in that situation so that when we get there, and I hope we don't, how do we actually have a sense about control and not to be able to deal with a scenario in a different way? And that keeps us up every night, that given the way in which our country has become so interdependent and connected, we've mapped the top 220 systems of national significance that fundamentally make the economy function. And the impact that has, if one of those systems were to be taken out, we've modelled that, and it is significant and potentially catastrophic. But it gets worse when you look at all of the incident response plans for those 220 assets, and you realise pretty quickly that they make so many of the same assumptions, that they will use the same cybersecurity providers, that they will use the same types of responses that are in short supply. And we think about at the national level, how do we deal with that scenario? Who would we recommend to prioritise first? And what does that mean for long-term outages and cascading impact? And if you look at what's happened today and what the government's calling out with other like-minded countries across the world, including Japan and Poland and Germany and the rest of the Five Eyes, that's a difficult scenario that we have to contemplate if we're thinking about long-term resilience. And so I think foundationally, we've got to think more and more about what might a catastrophic incident look like, and how might we protect ourselves from that. One of the other observations that we've definitely seen is people go about protecting things that they don't know exist. And that's why at the Commonwealth level, you might have seen that we, under the Protective Security Policy Framework, have required everyone to do a stock take of their internet-connected devices. And the reason why we did that is because so many people said, we don't have a good handle about what we're trying to protect. And I think the short answer for us is, well, if you don't know what exists, how are you going to protect it? And so having an understanding about particularly the technology estate that we're collectively protecting, the people who interact with that estate, and the processes that underpin both the people and the technology are foundationally important. And increasingly, as Colin pointed out before, data is at the heart of what we're trying to protect as well. And so how do you think about that as a system, and how do you protect it? And often that's the missing first step that is very hard to do, but equally is difficult for people to try and look at a particularly complex set of systems and particularly complex, technology estate, but also how people interact with it. I think that is a missing piece that if you were starting in a greenfields environment, you'd go back and start with first. Now, I mentioned risk management, and I wanted to give you a sense about some of the things that people are telling us. And I premise this by saying that the vast majority of companies and government agencies that I work with every day are very much focused on risk management and thinking about risk in really excellent terms. The vast majority of boards and CEOs I visit are engaged, curious, thinking about issues, are asking the right questions, and often are going above and beyond what the regulatory requirements are, which is what we would expect when we're having strong leadership on security issues. But concerningly, one critical infrastructure provider said to me, "We've got no material risks, nothing will stop us functioning." Until you realise pretty quickly that their whole enterprise is underpinned by a SCADA system which had pretty scant protection. Another one said, "We've got a lot of legacy systems, but of course we're not including those in our risk settings because actually you can't do anything with legacy systems to protect them." Another said, "Well, we don't have any critical risks with people. And in fact, we've only got 2 critical workers that work in our organisation. This is a large-scale organisation with many people accessing their control room. We have encountered a couple of organisations who have contemplated doing an exercise and have contemplated what might go wrong, but haven't actually actualised that. And so how do you actually practice and regularise it?" On the flip side, we've seen companies, particularly one I'm thinking of, who does it every quarter and reaches out to their respective CEOs to say, "Hey, I saw you had this incident. How did you deal with it? What can we learn? How did you deal with that so quickly? I'm not sure we would be able to do that as quickly." And so that's the good and the bad of boards. One organisation had 1 in 6 people click on a phishing link, and that was even after they were warned not to, which really shows for me that people are still at the heart of some of our security issues. A really important piece of critical infrastructure, which is out in the open, had nothing to physically protect it. And it is a particularly vital part of the nation's infrastructure. I won't tell you what it is because that'll tell people where to go and try and dismantle it. But we are working with that entity to say there are levels of protection you need over the most sensitive parts of your infrastructure asset. And the idea that there's no physical protection at all or no monitoring is deeply concerning. So at the heart of what we're learning is we're dealing with risk, we're dealing with the threat environment, but there is so much more than we can collectively go. And underpinning a lot of those concerns is a breakdown between the communications between the security professionals and the CEO of the organisation or the governing authority or board. And so I think the challenge for us is, how do we use each other? How do we use ASIL? How do we use the Trusted Information Sharing Network? How do we use signal groups where I know many of you, I'm on a few security signal groups. How do we share best practice? How do we build each other's capabilities to have those types of conversations? And how do we think about mitigation of risk? How do we bridge that divide between our leaders and our security professionals? How do we think about just not today, the risks that we face today, but we know that post-quantum encryption, Q-Day is coming soon. So how do we prepare our boards and CEOs for actually getting post-quantum encryption settings in place for the next couple of years, given that's how long it will take? So how do we balance that between now and into the future? And how do we have those investment discussions, I think, is the biggest challenge for us. And how do we start to educate and invest in people so that we can start to build a security professional in every individual, in every organisation that we collectively work at? So hopefully that gives you a sense about some of the protective security issues that we're dealing with, some of the challenges that we face, and not only is there so many solutions that I think are possible if we all work together and think about how do we shape the security environment that we'd like to have over the next couple of years. So thank you. Look forward to engaging with you soon. I was trying to get us back on track on timing. You're welcome.
Shami from the Department of Industry, Science and Resources.
Hello.
Hamish, you mentioned one company that was self-compelled to report, I think, 20 to 24 or a number of boards, I think. What are we doing in that space to sort of streamline that process, to just make it easier to then have like an overarching easy way for people to report? And if in that particular example, what led them to get to report to the multiple areas?
Yeah, so it was 27 different government organisations or stakeholders, and that included ministers' offices. It included at the state and territory and federal level. It included multiple regulators. When you look at what regulators ask, people are asking for reports in slightly different ways. So if you're the privacy regulator, you're effectively saying, has there been a breach of people's privacy, and how do we respond to that? If you're prudentially regulated, you might have a requirement for there's an impact to my organisational resilience under the 230 standards or prudential standard, or if you're a regulated critical infrastructure entity, you might have to report a cyber incident within 12 or 72 hours. So people are asking for different things in different ways. The first step that we've had is to create a single reporting portal set of advice about what you need to report, which is available on cyber.gov.au. The next step is to do a single form that we can satisfy multiple regulators. We're starting at the Commonwealth level. We already have, if you report through Report Cyber to the Australian Signals Directorate, that satisfies or can satisfy, depending on the boxes you tick, the Department of Home Affairs, the Office of the Information Commissioner, and we're working on whether or not that can satisfy other regulators, but we've got to design the form, the process, and that's our next step, because in the middle of a crisis, notifying that many people is difficult, but equally, everyone has a role to play in managing the system and managing particularly the impact that's had.
Hamish, that was a fantastic presentation. I heard you say quite a few things around boards and executives not actually knowing what to decide on. What's the lingo around this? When is it? When the technology investments are sufficient, or what's happening tomorrow? Another request for budget. That kind of situation. I've been trying to launch upward mentoring type projects with organizations where the younger, more technically apt crowds actually helping boards and executives to get their head around what questions to ask, at least. Do you see that starting to happen within organizations, that those skills are workshopped in some way?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a couple of things are happening. The Australian Institute of Company Directors have put out a really good guide about what to ask, and I think that's helping company directors. I spoke to a company director the other day who is being much more demanding, and even though they don't know the technical advice that they're getting, they just ask, and how does that work? And what does that mean? A bit like Colin's point about asking, how would you explain it to a 5-year-old? I think people are being much more demanding because they're seeing particularly company director liabilities. And I think people are genuinely getting better at saying, here are the options. And the biggest kind of question I get is, what's the percentage investment I should have on cybersecurity as part of a technology investment? Is it 5%, 10%? So it really depends on the technology. And then the next kind of big question is, should I invest in prevention? Should I meet a standard like the Essential 8, or should I try and meet the NIST standard, or should I invest in incident response? And that's a tricky question to navigate. And if people come with a preconceived view about, no, you have to invest in this capability, it's not helping the board come to their own realization about what their options are. So I think a bit of flexibility as well is probably the next step.
Wonderful. If there's no more questions, let's please give it up for Hamish one more time. Thank you so much for your contribution.